Naira volatility, worries or opportunities. When I got this topic, I thought to myself two things. There are things that businesses are going through that we are very, very familiar with. And or let me say investors, whether you are existing or a would-be investor, of the same metrics or the same situation that we face. The only difference is that if you have already invested, then you're wondering how to sustain your investment. And if you have not invested, you're thinking whether to still go ahead with that investment or not. However, because most of us seated here, we know the nitty-gritty of businesses. There are people that run manufacturing businesses and all kind of businesses here. So I'm not going to be focusing on the micro part of businesses. I thought to share things. I just thought to share my thought on what I call Nigerian transition economics since 1970. If you understand how this transition works, it's very, very easy for you to predict another time there will be a volatility. So this volatility is not surprise to anyone that has followed Nigeria's transition economy since 1970. That means volatility transitions since 1970. Then I thought to look at 2 decades. One, I believe that we had significant stability. That's in 2004 to 2013. And the other one from 2014 to 2023, where we had what we can call volatility that we are still dealing with at the moment. And how do they compare? Then I will end with what I call the current outlook. We are dealing with current uncertainties and volatilities. And I hope from there you'll be able to pick 1 or 2 things. So first, historically, and I mean from over 60 years, I mean almost 60 years now, since 1970, whenever there's going to be a shock in Nigeria, it comes through oil price. However, the last shock from 2022 did not come through oil price for the first time. It came through oil output, and it came through food and energy. So I will talk more on that. But from 1970, anytime there was a shock in oil price, that's how Nigeria is usually affected. So there's a shock in oil price, either a significant decline or a significant rise in oil price. So if you have a significant rise in oil price, you have a positive shock, and of course a significant decline means a negative shock. But that was the experience 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000. However, of course, at one point, we got so complacent that we actually stopped investing even in the oil. So the last shock was not about oil price. It was actually about oil output and, of course, food and energy prices. But safe to say that all shocks, except the last one, usually come through oil price. So I'm talking about transition. So whenever there is a significant decline in oil price, what happens next? The next thing that happens is your trade balance is affected. So you have, so that means oil revenues fall. And the Nigerian situation is very, very peculiar. It's peculiar in the sense that all types of straight shocks in Nigeria are also fiscal shocks. So not all economies have that kind of situation where times of trades are actually fiscal shocks. But in Nigeria, all times of trades are fiscal shocks because government own our crude oil. So whenever you have a decline or significant decline in oil prices, the first impact is actually on fiscal resources. Why is that a problem? In our fiscal history also does not have inbuilt flexibility for adjustment. It does not have inbuilt flexibility for adjustment. So the moment you have a significant, and I'll be talking about negative shock, obviously, because that's what brings volatility. So the moment you have a significant decline in oil prices, immediately reflects in your trade of balance and immediately reflects in your fiscal resource decline. So you can see the example here from 2010 fine up to 2014. Then 2014 to 2015, there was a significant decline in Nigeria's trade balance, and of course, it's been very, very volatile since then. So that's the next transition. The third transition is that immediately you have a decline in your trade balance. Obviously, there's pressure on your exchange rate. There's pressure on your exchange rate. So coming back to the Nigerian situation, and this is where I'm telling you a story, and whenever, please follow my story. So the Nigerian situation is such that whenever there is a significant decline in oil price, fiscal resources actually decline. In most cases, we cannot even hold on a stability for 2 months. It is that bad. We can't hold on stability for 2 months. So there's a reason why we can do that. So the third aspect of our transition is exchange rate fluctuations. The fourth aspect of that transition, so you have oil decline, you have balance of trade decline, and of course you have, then the fourth one, we begin to borrow immediately because we cannot hold on for 2 months, so we begin to borrow. And so every significant fall in oil price has been followed by a spike in debt, both domestic and of course foreign. But you borrow up to an extent also in Nigeria that it gets to a point that you cannot even borrow. So what do? You know what I mean? The last man, you know what he did. So that's that. And of course, the moment you borrow, you have significant deficit and you have significant debt. The next point is you have rise in prices. Obviously, there's now price pressure. So there's price pressure, and you have rise in prices because one, there is actually our own research has actually shown that inflation in Nigeria is a markup of the exchange rate that we see in Nigeria over time. I don't have that data to show you here, but that is our own conclusion. And finally, you have a weak growth. You have weak growth. So if you look at the last 10 years, which is the graph that you're looking at the moment, the average growth in the last 10 years is 1.5%. So if your population is doing about 3%, it means that in the last 10 years, everyone born into Nigeria has actually been born into a poorer and poorer economy. So let me recap. Because if you understand this transition, then you can explain to anyone the volatility in Nigeria. You have a significant fall in oil price, and that immediately reflects in balance of trade. And following that, you have rise in debt, then you have exchange rate pressures, and of course, you have inflation, and follow that you have weak economic growth. So let me now show you the second part. I just want us to compare and contrast what happened between 2004 and 2013 with 2014 and 2023. I thought it's important to compare 2 decades. I am not sure there's any decade that Nigeria had it so good like the 2004 to 2013. We have never had it that good. And I will tell you why. Because it was long, it was stretched, and we were largely able to consolidate, except that we do not consolidate in some very, very critical areas of the economy. So let's look at some metrics, and we look at what it means for an economy to actually, for the Nigerian economy to be volatile, comparing 2 decades, the one before the one that we are in now, right? So if you look at the whole share index, this is probably the most palatable. So our share index 2004 to 2014. So it was largely rising, although not very, very significant, largely rising. And of course, we know the spike of 2005 to 2008, of course, because of banking consolidation. That's why we have that significant spike the last year, about 3 years. But from then, it's been kind of steady until 2014. Steady, but not necessarily volatile. So that's it. But let's look at what happened since then. Since 2014, it's been relatively flat until 2020 when it started to rise slightly. So the whole share price is here. You don't actually see much volatility in terms of what we're talking about because share prices, there are so many things that determine share prices, and obviously there are very, very short-term movements in share prices. Let's look at the exchange rate, 2004 to 2014. Relatively stable. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 critical adjustment. That's, of course, the 2008 to 2009 adjustment, and then you have the 2014 adjustment. But otherwise, the exchange rate was relatively stable. So what does that mean? That means that you're a foreigner, you want to invest in Nigeria. It was very, very easy for you to look 3, 4, 5 years in advance because the exchange rate was stable, and it was actually stable for a long time. Stable exchange rate does not mean that it's fixed. It just means that at least it is predictable, which is not the case at the moment. But look at what happened since then. So if you look at 2016, obviously you see that significant movement. Then 2020, and you look at 2022, and of course, we had the mess of the last 1 year. So in terms, you're comparing the 2 decades, so you see significant adjustment in the last decade compared to the one before. So that's exchange rate. Now, let's look at FDI, and this is a very critical metric when we talk about investors in Africa, investors in Nigeria, or investors globally. FDI is usually a very good barometer to watch it for. If we look at the 2004 to 2014, the least investment was in that 2005 when we were still trying to grow our investment. But by 2006, FDI was doing a minimum of $5 billion US. 2007, $5 billion US, and by 2009, we were doing in excess of $8 billion US. The same in 2010. There was a slight decline in 2011, but even at that point, we do $6 billion US. And of course, by 2014, we were doing between 5 and 6 billion US dollars. But just look at 2015 to 2022. So we started from 4.5 billion US dollars in 2015, and of course declined 2016 to 3 billion, rose a bit in 2017, then significant decline up to 2019. And even all those declined by 2022, we haven't really done more than 3 billion US dollars. So that's to show that in the period of volatility, investors actually do stay away. And there are so many reasons to do that, and we'll come to that. But look at inflation. If you look at inflation here, you look at 2004, it was still a bit volatile. But just look at it from that 2008. If you look at it from 2008, it was stable, and started to decline until 2014. So for the first time in about a decade, we actually had consistent single-digit inflation. Single-digit inflation, at least from 2013 to 2014. And obviously, it's been spiked since then. So 2004, that was when we were still trying to stabilize the economy. But from 2006, inflation actually was stable until 2014. But look at what has happened between 2015 and 2024. We're talking about 9% in 2014. But look at it from that 9%, 10%. Now we are talking at over 32%. That's within the period of a 2 decade. We have added 200 basis points to inflation. If you want to contrast that, recall that in 2022, when there was significant spike in the rise of prices and, of course, inflation in developed economy, when the global economy experienced high inflation for the first, I'm talking developed economies now, first time in 40 years. When inflation got to 8% and 9%, they started to panic, right? And they did everything to bring it down to the current 3%, 2%. No, it has not reached 2% yet. The point I'm trying to make now, you compare that to we battling inflation of about over 30%, close to 40%, especially when you talk about food prices. So the last decade has really been very volatile. So, and we have the growth to back it up, to back up the evidence that stable outlook gives people the best possible economic opportunity. So if you look at Nigeria's growth also from 2004, we were doing over 6%, 2005, about 6%. I mean, it was just like an average of 6% all through. And of course, through that, we became the largest economy in the world in 2014. But however, if the average then was 6% in a decade, the average that we had in the following decade, as I share with you, was 1.5%. So what is it that stood out in the last decade is that we had 3 economic shocks and we had 2 economic recessions. We had 3 economic shocks and we had 2 economic recessions. So the first shock obviously was the 2014, the 2016 decline in oil prices. The second one was the 2020 COVID-19, and of course the third one was the Russian-Ukraine war shock. And of course the recession we had was 2016, 2017, and 2020 when we had another recession. Let me just deliver a fun fact here, a fun fact for those people that are interested in fun facts. Nigeria has only had 3 economic recessions in its history. Only 3 economic recessions in its history, entire history. And those 3 were under President Muhammadu Buhari. So that's a fun fact. Why did I say that fun fact? Is because out of all the two economic recessions, you could not avoid the 2020 recession. Nobody will blame anyone for the 2020 recession. It was a pandemic. However, the recession of 2016, 2017 was not necessary. Now let's look at today. This is where I believe I'll spend maybe another 10, 15 minutes. Is that correct? Okay. So current outlook, dealing with uncertainties and volatility. Let me show you. Let's go to some economics class. For anyone that has done economics, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, demand and inelastic curve. What it simply means is that irrespective of the rise in prices, right, demand does not shift. People still demand, and that is what is happening to US dollars demand at the moment. So what are the things that people are using it for? Imports, education, travels, and other things. But those are the normal things that I used to use it for. But what's happened this time is that because of the volatility and because we have to preserve our value in US dollars wealth, we have started to demand US dollars for the sake of it. So you begin to demand currency for the sake of it. That's because you want to preserve the value. That's just basically what it is. It's not necessarily speculative demand, but it's just because you want to preserve your. And let me just say this, in 2024, 2023 and 2024, the opportunities to do that are huge compared to probably 20 years ago. The opportunities to do that are huge compared to 20 years ago. Compared to 20 years ago, the outlet for that were very, very small. But now that is not the case. That is not the case. You can just stay. You don't have to have been to the U.S. to invest in U.S. stock exchange in 2024. You don't have to have been to UK to invest in the UK in 2024. But in 20 years ago, those outlets were not there. So what does that mean? What does that mean for an economy like Nigeria? It means that economic management, more than ever before, now has to be very, very sound, because the private individual will not tolerate any nonsense for even a day. So if your economy is not going to give investors, whether domestic or foreign, what they want, easily they move out. Easily. Even if they don't move out physically, and we have been hearing people moving out physically, but the ones that are not moving out physically, if I take a survey here now, if you are being honest, there'll be 1 or 2 stories of people investing from here and investing abroad. Why? Because the domestic economy is not giving them the kind of returns that that they want, and of course compared to other economies, mainly because of volatility. But let's stick to this graph. So you have demand inelastic. So you have rise in prices, but demand does not actually shift. So it means that no matter the rise in prices, people will keep demanding. So there is no demand, there's no response, significant response to higher prices of the commodity, and in this case, the US dollars. So let's look at supply. Supply is also inelastic. What that means is that it does not matter how increased the price is as well. You are also not attracting supply into the market. So there must also, so when you have this situation, you have demand inelastic, you have supply inelasticity, then you have what we call market rigidities. And that is what the Central Bank of Nigeria was actually trying to correct recently. And I believe they're still trying to do that. So you have market rigidities. So when you have market rigidities, this value that you now have is truly not a reflection of the underlying value of the assets, but you now have a reflection of the market rigidity. So if people are not supplying US dollars and people continue to demand US dollars, then the result is that the price just keep going up, which is not a reflection of the performance of the Nigerian economy relative to the performance of the US economy. It's just a reflection of the market rigidity. So I was in a meeting like this sometime last year, and I said at the time, and this is where I believe the mistake was made. The mistake was made not in February, not in January. The mistake was made between August and December. Between August and December. And I will tell you what I mean by that. There was an impression that it does not matter how the rate goes. It does not matter. It can continue to go because the government was not responding. The central bank was not responding. Nobody was actually trying to bring the rates down. And I said at the meeting at that time, it's almost a year now, August last year, I said if we don't tame this volatility at the moment, it may get to 5,000. People screamed. They screamed it can never get to 5,000. No, don't say that. We thought it would never get to 1,000. We thought it would never get to 2,000, but it did. When I mean 2,000, it did. At least Sterling got to 2,000. The point is that when you have volatility, it's easier for you to deal with it when you have volatility of 5-10% variation in your value. But when you begin to have 70-80%, it becomes like a game. And that is what we had in the last 7 months. So anyway, this is where we are at the moment. So what is the policy goal? I'm narrowing down. What is the policy goal? The policy goal that I see, and is a tough one, is I see, if you look at from 2014 to 2023, if you look at the trade of balance differences, it's a back of the hand envelope, calculation. So I'm not saying we did any serious calculation, but if you look at the trade balance differences, the decade before and the decade after, the decade that's the 2004 to 2014 and the decade after. And then you look at the gaps in the revenues and oil prices. You look at the gaps in foreign investment. You look at the gaps in remittances. You're probably talking about a $200 billion US gap that has given rise to this volatility. But it may not even be up to that. It may just be 100 to 150 billion US dollars. But that is the policy goal here. How do you bridge that gap? How do you bridge that gap? Whether it's in remittances, whether it's in foreign portfolio flows, whether it's in FDI, whether it's in raising oil revenues or non-oil export, how do you build that gap? So that is the policy question that we have. So there are 3 ways it can be done. The first one is through policies. If you do it through policies, and there's no guarantee that it will succeed, but if you do policy, the important thing to note with policies is that it will take 2 to 3 years. With consistent, credible, profound policies, it will take 2-3 years to actually stabilize your economy. Then if you sell assets, it may take about 1 to 3 years, depending on how quickly you can sell assets. And of course, if you do borrowing, of course, you have the IMF, you have the World Bank, you have a time lag of about 3 to 6 months, depending on how much you can borrow. But there is nothing that suggests that these policies are one or the other. They are not mutually exclusive. So you can actually follow the three policies, and I can show you here that they are trying to follow these three economic policies. So let me now introduce this. You can group those three economic policies under a grouping I call domestic savings or foreign investment. Domestic savings or foreign investment. So the first one is savings, current account, net income. That is how much of your exports, revenues can you actually save? How much of it can you save? At the moment, I don't think we are saving any. But that is the first aspect of it. The second one then is how much of FPI and FDI can you actually attract? So I've shown three things. There's policy, there's sales of asset, there's borrowing. But they can come in two ways. You can either save your exports proceeds, and of course, you can also attract FPI and of course, FDI. However, so three ways to adjust this to macroeconomic instability. So one, you have access to official external finance, you have fundamental systemic reforms, and you have adjustment to monetary policy and fiscal policy. So let's look at how the government is handling these three, right? So the first one, access to external finance. This is one that they have really tried to, exhaust as much as possible. So there's a 3 billion Afrexim Bank, which they got 2.25 in. There's a 1.5 billion from World Bank. There's another 3.5 billion euro bond, which we expect in the second half of this year. And then, of course, recently they went for the spring meetings and they got another 2.5 billion from the World Bank. I don't know whether they received that yet. So the point is access to finance. But what we have noticed about this access to finance here is that it is not as significant as we thought it was possible. So if you think Egypt was able to actually get in the region of 40 billion US dollars, but we are struggling to get something less than 10 billion dollars. So it means the access to finance is not as hopeful as we thought. So that's number one. The second one is adjustment to fiscal and monetary policy reform. So in terms of fiscal policy, I learned that they canceled Ways and Means, but there's also reports that they did not cancel Ways and Means. I don't know which one is true, to be honest. I don't know. But I'm only saying what I know. That's fiscal policy. But in terms of monetary policy, and this is where we have had a very, what I call heavy lifting. The heavy lifting we have had is actually from monetary policy. So if you look at it, first they cleared the US 7 billion backlog. That is incredible, to be honest. Within the space of 3-4 months for you to be able to clear that backlog. And of course, they raised MPR. They raised it to 24.75. Bank lending rates now between 30 to the commercial papers, TBs, FGN, CRR, prudential buffers. So there are loads and loads of stuff that the Central Bank of Nigeria has carried out. What are they trying to do? Obviously, tighten monetary policy and, of course, improve the ease in which market can actually trade and be able to attract foreign exchange. So that is what they have done. So you tighten compliance, they also ease market restrictions, and they tighten monetary policy instruments. So the progress that we saw from February up to the end of maybe up to last week, so to say, the progress that we saw was on the back of this. So what happened since last week, or what happened during this period? I'm sure that's the question that most people are asking. And that's the question I hope I can answer next. So we had, of course, weak. Our exchange rate is weak. This is the result, volatile exchange rate. But let me just go to this. Of course, we have rise in interest rate. So let me answer these questions. Are these measures enough? Because I believe that's what you probably want to hear. Are these measures enough? And the answer is no. No. At the current rate that we are going, I don't see any significant stability in 2 years. And I will tell you why. The focus is on policies. And the problem with policy is that the focus is on one-sided policy. The focus is on policy, and the focus is on 30% or 20% of policy. So if you actually want to do policy, your policy has to be actually very, very comprehensive. And I will show you what I mean now. It has to be extremely comprehensive, and it has been done before. And I'm not talking of outside of this country. It has been done in Nigeria before. So at the moment, we have monetary policy doing all the hefty lifting, but these are all short-term instruments. So within 3 months, they wear out. I mean, you raise interest rate, people invest, but they won't do any significant investment on the basis of raise in interest rate. I'm talking of FPI. So you really, really need a significant chunk of US dollars in terms of investment and, of course, in terms of other kinds of inflow into the country. So the answer is they're not enough, but let me show you what I mean. One, you need systemic reforms, and of course you have the exchange rate first, or you have the exchange rate reform, you have power, you have grants, you have banking recapitalization. These are all part of the systemic reforms. You need security reforms, civil service reform, fiscal reforms, land and cultural reforms. All this will, I hope they will come, but that's not where I'm going. This is where I'm going to. So if you look at the Asian economies, they suffered in 1996 and 1997, what we call the 1997 Asian crisis. Everybody is familiar with that. They had grown also for about a decade and a half consistently, all these economies. So whether it's talking about Indonesia, you're talking about Thailand, and of course you're talking about Korea, all these guys grew, over a 15-year period. And if you look at this graph very, very well, so I have the one for Indonesia, and I have the one for Hong Kong, I have the one for Malaysia, and I have the one for Philippines. So that dip, you look at all of them, they dipped in 1997. They all dipped. However, within 2 years, they all started to raise their foreign reserves again. Why were they doing that? Because they understood the game of international investment. The game of international investment only responds to one thing: your foreign reserves. That is the only thing that the game of international investment responds to. They do not respond. I'm not saying you should not have infrastructure. I'm not saying you should not have power. Yes, you should have all those things. But the one that they really, really respond to is they respond to your growth in foreign reserves. Within 2 years, all these economies bounced back. They bounced back. And sometimes, even in the 2 years, they recovered their losses in exchange rate. So I said that it's not only these countries that have done it before. Nigeria has also done it before. So let me show you Nigeria. This is Nigeria. This is not the graph of any other country. This is the graph of Nigeria. So in Nigeria, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, our foreign reserves remained flat. It remained flat. But from 2003, it began to spike. And it reached $58 billion in 2008. And bear in mind that within the same period, we actually paid $18 billion in foreign to cancel our foreign debt. If you don't believe this metric, that this is what we need, the answer is, can we repeat this? If you don't think that this is what we need to shed volatility, let me go back to some of the data. I deliberately did not mention this so that I can show you this. So let me go back. Look at this. Foreign direct investment did not start to peak until 2005 in response to your foreign reserves. That is why he started to peak. It's not because the fundamentals in Nigeria were not good in 2003 or in 2002. It was because at that time they did not see their own foreign, they did not see your foreign reserves. And I'll tell you the meaning of foreign reserves in a moment, but that is one. Then two, let's check inflation. This is good. So inflation also, if you notice inflation also, after that 2008, so you now have price stability all through for almost a decade, following increases in your own foreign reserves. So that is what happens to inflation. And of course, let's now go to growth. And growth, from 2004, 2005, 2006, your growth started doing 6%. So It is the growth in the foreign reserves that international investment community respond to. So if you want to actually deal with your economic volatility, then you have to grow your foreign reserves. You have to grow your foreign reserves. So how do you, let's go back to that data. So how do you grow your foreign reserves? Okay, so if you look at 2003 to 2008, right, if you look, I came back to Nigeria in 2007, the infrastructure was awful. I couldn't drive through VI at that time. It was bad. However, everyone was pouring into Nigeria economy. Thank you, sorry, 1999, yes. 1999, yes, when Obasanjo came in, yes, to 2008, yes, 1999. Yes, so by 2000, you're having 10 billion, 2003, 8 billion, but from 2003, he started to spike. So we started to save heavily. We started to save heavily, and that was how we were able to grow our foreign reserves. So when we say we started to save heavily, who was saving? It was not necessarily me and you that was saving. It was the government that was saving. So many people have asked me, what is missing so far in the economic policy of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu? Simple, they are not saving. They are consuming heavily. So in order to deal with volatility, all our fiscal resources cannot be also following the dollar. It's supposed to be keeping the dollar. That is what President Olusegun Obasanjo did. They kept the dollar. Let me tell you how it works, and I hope you get it. The way he works is this. I don't know how many of us has borrowed from the bank before. You don't have to raise up your hand. But if you want to borrow from the bank asks you one question. What is your equity? Foreign reserves is the developing economies' equity in their own investment. Without that, your own equity, it's your insurance. Because they know that with any shock in the system, without foreign reserves, the value of your currency will just continue to depreciate, which is what we are having at the moment. So if I were the government, even if it's $200 million or even if it's $500 million, I will begin to save. I'll begin to put aside. Because over a 2-3 year period, you will be able to have a stable currency. At the moment, I don't know where that stable currency will come from because we don't have any significant reserves. Everyone knows because JP Morgan told us that. I wish that report never came out. I genuinely, as a Nigerian, I really wish that report never came out. Because when many people say, oh, but the last administration was able to stabilize it. The last administration was able to stabilize it because that market information was not there. Because we all thought we had $33 billion US. So if you were going to stake your money, right, do you have up to that to fight the government? Do you get my point? Because that's what you do. When you are buying, you just keep buying dollar because you say, it can never come down. You just keep buying it. It's because you know that the government does not have reserves to defend it. But every country that have the reserves to defend, even China is still defending their currency. Korea is still defending their currency. Every country defends their currency. But what they do before they do that is they pile up their reserves. We have not done that. And until we do that, I think we will struggle in terms of volatility. So let me end. So I think the summary of what I'm saying there is that economic growth is not given. It's not given. Economic growth anywhere in the world is not given. It is underlined and in response to both domestic economic policies, measures and programs, and how the economic response to economic shocks. But what we know is economic acceleration is generally faster. Decades after decades, it's faster. So it took the UK to double in 100 years, US in 53 years, China in 12 years, India in 16 years. So every country that has developed, they've developed faster than the one before it. So why is it that we are not able to crack it? The way you do it is that you save you save. You make the sacrifices and save. When you save, then others will come and join you and grow the economy together. And I think it will be on that note that I say thank you.
Awesome. Wow. Wow.